Hi there.
Hey, hello. Back again.
Yeah. Back to our sci-fi talk. I
Hmm.
am very curious to learn a little bit more about the ideas of what it is to live in space, like traveling through space or in, I don't know, eons.
Okay.
So we learned last week about the different types of space travel,
Hmm.
and that was fascinating. Um, Part of that is always traveling on a ship and on a spaceship, right?
Hmm.
And now I'm curious to learn about life on that ship
Okay.
and what the different scenarios are,
Hmm.
and how it would be structured, like living there for how long would you need to prepare, like how do you create resources to
Hmm.
um, last a long time, because space travel takes a long time.
Right,
So,
exactly.
yeah, why don't you tell me a little bit about that?
Okay. Yeah, this is some good problems in the structure that's going to determine the story in a way. Like, if, last week we talked about whether you would be using some kind of warp drive and or whether you would spend a long time, you know, basically frozen or generations. And each one of that creates much different setup for living, or and for stories as well, stories to be placed there. One of the simplest is sort of where the space travel is analogous to sea travel, and that's the way a lot of science fiction does it, where you get on a spaceship, you spend a certain amount of time, several weeks, and then you get off. And that's actually a great way to set travel. In the universe I'm working on now, we have two levels of that. One is between planets, and then one is between star systems. And in both cases, the transits take a couple months, and that creates a
Couple months?
yeah. So they're weeks to months depending on the transit. So there has so people are paying a lot of money. They don't want to just go up there and like sit in a little room all the time. So these types of ships are huge luxury ships, like the early, 20th century luxury liners, where there's all these entertainments and everything going on. Because the people who can afford to travel like this are the wealthiest people in the society, right? So that's this, the setup, the structure of it. But still, you concern a lot about limited resources, right? Like you have to have there's only a certain amount of, water, nutritious
Then,
substances. Yeah, things have to be broke down and recycled. Pretty much everything has to be recycled and put to use again.
oh,
So, so those systems affect a lot how the people live in that environment. And and of course the classic Star Trek is built something like that, except that they go to a different planet every week, or something, along those lines. And that's the
they won't
first
have
big.
to worry about trash because they can just like open the back of the ship and like forget about it.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. And they also, they get resources by going places. They stop places,
Mm.
get new resources. Um,
But
and
they also need to consider weight when they collect these resources.
Oh yeah. Although you want to keep the waste to absolute minimum, because if you're out there for a long time, the waste is actually also a resource, right? It's some kind of matter that can be used somehow. If you're just breaking it down and somehow combusting it for propulsion or something, or um, sooner or later you want to make use of
So
everything.
Back to the Future, the guy on the third movie, he was just using trash.
Well,
On the
exactly, yeah.
whole thing was about like finding uranium, I think it was.
Well, there's two. Well, I won't go into the whole range of fission versus fusion right now, but yeah, a lot. I mean, right now we basically fusion where we think about in terms of hydrogen, or very low end elements. But you could use a lot of elements along that curve, and most of your trash is going to consist of stuff that could theoretically be used in fusion. So somehow or other, you want to try to use everything as you're traveling. Um,
Real. Like this is real
yeah,
science. You can
yeah.
turn trash into like fusion material.
Theoretically, the
Theoretically.
engineering, yeah, the engineering isn't even close right now. Like there's no easy
Hmm.
path to doing any of that. It's talk, but it's talk, just in pure terms of the mass energy curves and whether or not there's energy available. Yes, there is definitely all the way up
Wow.
till iron and cobalt. So,
Okay.
but that's a whole separate topic. We won't get in that.
Next sci-fi talk.
Yeah, but the point is, the author has a lot of flexibility. Like, what do you want to be limited? I was in the submarine in the Navy, and we had food loadouts for a certain amount of time. That's how long we could stay underwater. We did stay for months underwater sometimes. Our water was limited by how much we could produce from the ocean. Desalinate. So those are limits that constantly impacted how we live compared to how you live normally on land. And for us, space was an issue. How much interior space you had. You didn't have very much. You didn't have places to put your stuff, or particularly to sleep or anything. But you can make that much different on a spacecraft. You with different, depending on what kind of drive you're using. There's no real theoretical reason it has to be limited in space. You could, I'm working right now on one where there's these large passenger areas on these ships, luxury ships, and it gives people like parks. They have they have like this whole small little art city that they live in while they're traveling through space.
Why can't
And that
submarines just be huge? I mean, isn't deep space huge?
Well, submarines have a much more limiting problem because they're going through water, right? So that they're displacing a huge amount of water as they go through. Space being a vacuum, you can a, a large object, once it's elevated to a speed, could go through it almost as easily as a small object. So it's not.
Okay.
So the physical size is much less of a restriction.
Hmm. Yeah, the
Uh,
density requires a lot more force to be applied.
exactly. Um, but the author can still limit it that way. I mean, for any particular technology, a culture's technology, it may be difficult to create large spacecrafts with lots of room. Like right now, we don't, engineering wise, we don't have the capability to easily make spacecraft with lots of room. We could. There's ways we could think of to do it, because if we started the a spacecraft off from orbit instead of on the planet, it's much easier to do that with a large spacecraft because you don't have to accelerate it all the way through out of the gravity well.
Yeah, yeah.
Um, but
But then if you're landing in a planet, like you couldn't really land, you would always have to stay on orbit. Otherwise, you would have the same issue when you go from
right,
planet to planet, basically.
yes, and yeah, exactly. So what happens on the other end of the voyage is also dictates kind of what your limitations are. Um, if you have to actually land on a planet, that's a huge engineering difference. You can't actually have one of these large spaceships that just sort of float through space in kind of this luxury atmosphere, right? Because they're not going to be able to land.
Capsules to drop people, small
Yeah,
stuff.
yeah. You would have some kind of drop ship or something that would take people down to the surface, but you wouldn't take your spaceship down there. Also, knowing what's there is a big limitation. If you're going out in space and you're going to some planet, you're just hoping they'll have the resources you need. Your life, your mentality is a whole lot different than if if you're going to a planet that there's already people there, or you've really
Yeah.
scoped it out well. Um,
I have a
that
question.
changes
Like,
the nature of the story.
yeah, like when you're writing about these other planets, how do you control the need to just go wild? I mean, anything could be there, like all kinds of species. Like I don't know,
Mhm.
like
Well,
Rick and
part of
Morty
it.
when they talk about evolution and then like like chairs are sitting on people, like they just go wild, right? How do you kind of
Yeah.
like try to keep it, I don't know, evolutionarily possible?
Well, you try to keep it consistent within your universe, whatever that is.
Uh-huh.
You mentioned Rick and Morty. They have a universe in which the crazy happens all the time.
Yes.
Douglas Adams, with his Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, had a universe in which really crazy, improbable things happen a lot. Like, a planet full of mattresses, or a robot that was really super smart but got stuck on a planet for a million years before because they messed up time travel. There's a kind of absurdities, but that's in the nature of that universe, and it's consistent with it. In my,
Okay.
my universe is I try to stay close to what's possible, scientifically possible. Plus, and then the experimentation is usually more cultural, like what kind of cultures evolve in this situation. Um,
Oh, I see.
yeah, like one theory is that if you had a generation ships, that go from, that are going to go out, the idea that humanity has to seed other planets in order to survive, because eventually the Earth is going to collapse. Um, that's a thought, and that's a reason to have ships going out. But those ships would be full of people who are never going to see the destination, and they're never really even going to know if it's going to be successful. So, what's the psychology of that like? How do they live with each other? How do they make important decisions?
It's kind of
Um,
religious, don't you think? Like, how do you convince people to put in all the work to, for the species, I mean, for future generations to get all the
mhm.
benefits?
Well, and religion would be one answer. Some kind of
What?
religion would be an answer. It would be a structure, a way of thinking that people on the ship would have to have in order to always, focus on being of service to a future that they won't see. That's almost a religion in and of itself, but the mentality that goes with it would be a very religion like. Um,
Exactly.
but that's not the only. You could also have you could have cultures on a very large ship that interact with each other, maybe that don't even know what the real nature of the ship is. Like there's some other controlling force, but they're living on this situation, and you know
Like
they have their
Wally.
own little sets of values. And what's that? Like Wally. Well,
Yeah,
Wally sort of, yeah. I mean, they knew
yeah.
they were on a ship,
They
but they
don't.
didn't really
They
know
don't know
what
what
was
they
beyond.
don't know, right? They don't know what
Yeah,
they behind. They only know what's in front of them.
right.
That's
And they live a
really
very controlled existence. Because that's thought of as the best way to sort of keep things stable, which you do have to have some way to keep things stable.
yeah. That makes sense.
You can also have issues with different groups in that situation. You could have a controlling group. If you throw in the cryogenic angle, where some or all people are going to be um, frozen or put in stasis for a long part of the trip, then that can become part of the story too. I've actually had a story published in Science Fiction Age a long time ago, where the crew were basically went into some kind of cold storage, for years and years, and then woke up and then went back, and then the passengers didn't do that because they would be discharged at some planet or other. So what happened was you had this one character who aged very slowly. He would be 10 years and he'd only be a year older, 10 years, year older, and whereas the people he was interacting with, and of course he fell in love and all this stuff. Uh, she would be getting older in increments of 10 years, whereas instead of his 1 year. So
I guess
that's
they
that's
wake him up. I mean, it's kind of is it part
it,
of like keeping him alive or something?
well, it's keeping the crew is a high level of expertise, high level of training in this situation, right? In this situation,
Yeah.
in this universe, the people who
But like,
crew the
why?
ship.
I'm just curious. Like, why did he have to wake up every 10 years? Like,
Well, well, that's approximate, but the ship would have to make course adjustments, right, or go through a maintenance cycle or something like that. So every
Oh,
once in a while, the crew would have to come out of storage, or they could rotate, come out and spend their time doing what they do, and then when their expertise is no longer needed for some stretch, they would go back into cold storage. Uh, but
okay.
that, and of course that was somewhat the author's authorial choices, right? Like that set up the limitations in which the story then happens, and that's
Yeah.
just one way of doing it.
What
So
about like
and
conflicts in the ships, right? Like for resources. Would
well,
that be
exactly. What? Yeah, that'd be a very uh, uh, major issue, potential issue, and the reboot Battlestar Galactica series did pretty well with that one because a lot of times there's just not going to be enough, right? There's going to be hundreds of thousands of people may be involved in if the population is growing, um, the original allocation of resources might not be enough, and
yeah.
there's going to be some kind of conflict to determine who does get it,
Yeah. Some people
and
are
even
just reckless and they just take more than they should, right? They don't rationalize, they don't follow the
right.
rules.
Well, yeah, you would have that at any level, and then make it worse if there's less and less stuff. Where there's actually, even if everybody follows the rules, they won't have enough. That can happen either because of the initial allocation, population growth, or because the mission is taking much longer than people thought. Like if you like say we send a generation ship out, right? It's going to take 50 years to get to some planet to see if that's possible for people to live there. Well, it takes 50 years. It gets there. The planet's not feasible. So they have to go to the next planet, which is maybe 100 years further. Like, so you can't from Earth right now predict a planet that will be feasible for humans to live on. Like just by looking out there, we know that there are some planets that are sort of possibly Earth-like. That's about as much as we know. You know, um, whether we could live on them, we have no idea. So likely ships launched now or in the near future would be going out blind. They would be have some set of conditions that they would test when they got to the planet, but they really wouldn't know until they get to the planet. So it's a big gamble.
Have you ever explored like writing about cannibalism and stuff like that?
Um, in theory, that's it's almost has to happen, except that it wouldn't happen necessarily. Well, the way it happens, I think, in most authors deal with it is that even the human body has to be broken down like everything else, like all the stuff that occurs, the plant life and everything that grows on the ship is returned to some kind of giant composting thing, and that humans that die would also be there. So you wouldn't have direct cannibalism, but you also wouldn't have the right to take somebody's body and bury it so that the organic matter is not used in the system anymore because it's too much to waste, right?
Yeah, so all that compost would go to grow plants and stuff like that.
Well, that I mean that's one. Yeah, one theory is that you constantly break down matter that's been used. Like so, you have you're growing plants, you're using them for food, you're using them for oxygen production, balance, and maybe you're creating a larger ecosystem with some insects and things. And then when they break down, they have to break down again and be used for the next generation plants. And
Yeah.
there are certain nutrients that are probably going to decline over time, like nitrogen or something that's you're going to have to replace in that plant matter to keep it viable over the hundreds of years that you're going to try to do it. So those
What
are
about
technical issues. You have to
yeah?
try to make up an answer sometimes.
I was thinking more like if like they run out of resources and start like
Well, that's
eating
a
each
good
other at some point, but that's too dramatic for
that is a dramatic, but of course that would be the kind of story that you might want to do. You might want to um, set
like a
a
subgenre
story.
one called Sci-fi Terror.
Well, you could do it a lot of ways. I mean, you could do it cold terror, but you could also do it like, say, you're going to reach a planet in, like, you're going to make it in like 10, 20 years, right? But you don't have enough food left for everybody to make it. So people are talking about resorting to cannibalism, but they're trying to. Now you're having a fight over like who would die. Would it be the people who aren't going to get to the planet anyway? Would it be the people who have, like that would be somebody's logical outcome, right?
Yeah.
But there would also be self-interested people. There would be the people who want the future of humanity, still think of that in religious terms, as you said, and then there
Yes.
would be self-interested people or locally interested, like family level self-interested. So the conflicts would be play out between that.
So creepy. I wonder why they don't do like horror movies that are also sci-fi. Like, why not? Like, it could get so creepy out there. Like,
Well,
that would be
there are some, yeah,
yes.
there are some that are set on very
Really,
isolated ships. Yeah, yeah. Well,
really.
the original Alien was a horror movie. I mean, the franchise later become more of a monster style franchise, but the first one was horror.
Ah,
And then
and
Event Horizon,
what I need to watch. I need to watch all the
Alien.
references you've mentioned here. Like, I gotta go back to the video and start. Like, I seriously haven't watched any of them. That's
Oh
crazy.
yeah, I have a story about Alien. If you got time for a second.
I
So
got
my
time.
was that my
I got
ex-wife, when the first Alien came out, I saw it, scary as hell movie, right? And then the second one came out, Aliens sequel. I took my then wife, and she was not as scared as everybody else in the theater, and and then I realized probably the reason why she didn't get the setup. So there's a lot of setups in the second movie that go back to something that happened in the first movie, like the face
yeah.
huggers was a classic one.
Okay.
And then so she watched the first movie. After she watched the first movie, then the second movie was really scary to her. So
Oh, okay.
you have to have the frame of reference.
Franchise Alien versus
Predator,
something
yeah,
Predator.
Predator,
Yeah,
yeah. That's where it
that's
falls
the same.
apart.
That's
Yeah,
where
that's the same. That's the same.
that's
That's
where
the
it
same
becomes like
one.
a monster thing. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, I gotta
In my,
watch that. Now I'm curious.
in my opinion, it's Alien and Aliens are two really good movies, very different. Um, Alien 3 is okay. It probably shouldn't have been an Alien movie. And then after that, very downhill. So that's my opinion. Yeah.
Okay, so let's go back to the topic.
Okay.
Um, so I'm curious about oxygen. How do you solve the oxygen issue in your ships?
That's a big problem. So in the Navy,
Yes.
on a submarine, we solved the oxygen problem by breaking apart water, basically, right? Like
Really?
hydrolysis.
That's
Water
so
is hydrogen, oxygen. If
yeah,
you
exactly.
use electricity in certain ways, it'll break apart, and you'll have both gases. Um,
Wow.
but on a ship, yeah, the oxygen level is going to keep going down. You can recycle. You can use plants to get oxygen out of the carbon dioxide that's constantly being created. Uh, so you can keep re-injecting oxygen into the atmosphere in terms of uh, like percentage wise versus oxygen that's fixed into carbon and other matter inside the ship. What's really difficult is if you're losing carbon ambiently, like if I mean oxygen ambiently, like oxygen is not only being turned into carbon dioxide in breath, but somehow it also is escaping, even in a very minute level from the ship itself. That's something that's almost would be very difficult to replace. Um,
No,
in
it's
theory,
not.
your planners just have to have enough, you know, oxygen, like liquid oxygen, somewhere stored to replace it as the ship, over like a long period of time.
Okay. Oh,
The other theory is that you would send either you would go or you would send some drone ships to a planet where there might be oxygen in the atmosphere to collect oxygen and bring it back. So
that's
that would be
cool.
feasible, or so at least narratively plausible. We'll call it narratively plausible.
Yeah, because everything is so apart from each other.
Yeah. Hmm.
So big problem, huh?
Yes.
Is water that big a problem as well?
Well, water is going to be similar. Yeah, water is, first of all, it's two gases, and gases are always going to be gases are a lot more trickier to keep in the system of any kind, right? There's always even microscopic leaks
Yeah.
over a long 100 years is going to wreck whatever calculations you have.
Yeah.
So water, when it's in this water form, might not be lost as easily as the gases, although it could also leak out. But you probably the water is not always going to be water, right? It will probably sometimes broken down into hydrogen and oxygen, and then
Mhm.
maybe through um, oxygen and hydrogen will form water through rapid oxidation, fire. Hydrogen fire is a very dangerous thing, by the way. So yeah, so you water and water water is only like a one phase of the problem, right? The problem is you have two gases which could end up combusting with each other, but they can also end up very slowly leaking. And then
Yeah.
when they're combined to form water, that's also very essential. Um,
Wow.
still possible leaking. Yeah.
There's no
Um,
way to have like, I mean, isn't there a theory where like water is like becoming clouds and then like raining and then like back to the same process over and over again?
yeah, you could have a water cycle inside of a ship, even where you would have evaporation and then condensation.
But then if you
Uh,
need to use it, it's over. Like you're gonna run out of it, right?
well, it would still possibly, yeah, you're not going to create more water that way. You're going to
Yeah,
only ever have as much as you started with in the whole system,
yeah, yeah,
plus whatever could be made out of, whatever hydrogen and oxygen you have to have along. Hydrogen you can get in space, in theory. You could go, space is not a complete vacuum. So in
yeah.
theory, there you could put out these giant sails and they would scoop hydrogen.
Mm.
Whether that our technology would ever be able to pull that off, I don't know. But that's the theory some people have. Oxygen would be a little bit more difficult to get hold of, though.
I have a question. Like, are these spaceships usually there to protect you from the radiation, or what? Like, at least from the neck below.
Well, okay, so it depends.
I
Our
know it's like it
spaceships.
serves a lot of purposes, but like I'm just curious about the radiation. But go ahead, please.
It should, and our tech. If you're doing a story about life in space, you want the ships to be designed to protect from from whatever radiation occurs. Our spaceships right now don't really do that. Like you go to the moon, you come back, you have a huge radiation dose of some kind. I mean, they reduce it some, and the suits reduce it some, but radiation, you have to think in terms of materials that are going to, they call it like a half life, like reduce it by half or whatever, like the levels of radiation depending on the type of material. um, like water is a very big absorber of, say, neutrons, for instance. If you have a lot of neutron radiation, um, gamma radiation is pretty easy to block. Uh, like, oh, I'm sorry, no, it just in the light spectrum. Higher frequencies or X-rays, things like that can go through, and there's whole body. Those produce whole body radiation, which can be pretty dangerous.
Does
So,
radiation like mean basically like the entire light spectrum, or where does radiation start in the
oh,
light
that's
spectrum?
all. It's all radiation. Even
I thought
even
radiation. Gotcha.
yeah, radiation covers everything from what
Ah,
happens in your oven, the infrared, like
so you gotta be more
when the
specific.
things come
Like,
on,
are we talking about UV light or microwave
microwave radiation, right? So as you
radiation?
go up the spectrum, things change, right? Like
Yeah.
the reason visible light is the light spectrum that we use to see in is because it happens to reflect off all the surfaces around us, right? So
Uh,
that particular spectrum, part of the electromagnetic spectrum, turns out to be very, very useful for understanding the space that we're in. Um, and that's our eyeballs have evolved to capture just that part of the spectrum. But you go beyond it, you go into ultraviolet, you go into infrared below it, you
Yeah.
know, you the characteristics change. You know, the way they might penetrate um, surfaces much differently. You know, so it's you know, so you have to account for all those different possibilities with radiation, and radiation also applies to particulate radiation, neutrons, alpha radiation, beta radiation, different particles, basically. So, but that's less
All
of
right,
a
we
problem
don't
in
have much
space.
topics about radiation here
Yeah,
because
we
I
won't go too far
have
into
new questions and I think we're already way past our time here. But okay, so yeah, I think that's very interesting. In your book, you talk about generational trouble, right?
That's one. I've done that in some books. Yeah, generational generation shifts. So and that radiation is going to be a big issue there because one of the effects of radiation is to produce mutations. So, and you're already talking about a fairly small, relatively small gene pool. Even if your ship is carrying thousands of people, that's relatively a very small gene pool. High level of radiation, high level rate of mutation, then you're gonna have problems. You're also um, you want to get to a planet with this wide a diversity of genetics, the genetic core, the genetic library of humanity as possible, because the conditions there are unpredictable, and our variant genes allow us to react to different conditions differently, right? So if you're mutating
Explain
everything,
terror movie.
yeah, yeah. So if you're, and you want the genetic library that's sort of gone through human evolution on Earth. If you're mutating all through space, and you get there, you don't you don't have that. You don't have things that have been tested out well.
Come back to space after 1,000 years, and it's like what? Completely different species
Yes, yeah,
after all those
yeah.
mutations.
Mhm.
All right, so I think next time we can talk a little bit more about that.
Okay.
Um, well, thanks for explaining, and I guess we'll